He hit her on a Tuesday. Not because she had done anything wrong, not because dinner was cold or the baby had cried too long or the house was dirty. Marcus Vale hit Alara that Tuesday morning because she had looked at him, just looked at him, in a way he didn't like, a way that suggested she was still a person with thoughts of her own. She was holding their daughter. The baby was 4 days old. He hit her anyway. And in that moment, with her back against the kitchen wall and her newborn pressed to her chest, Alara Voss made a decision that would either save her life or end it. She waited until Marcus left for town. She wrapped her daughter in every piece of cloth she could find. She walked out the door. She didn't look back. If that were you, if you were holding your child and had nowhere to go, what would you do? This is the story of a woman who ran, and the man who opened a door he didn't have to open. If you're new here, subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The barn door had been frozen shut since October. Caleb Whitmore knew this the way he knew everything about his property. Not because he paid close attention, but because routine had become the only thing holding his life together. Every morning since Margaret died, he woke before light, put on the same boots, made the same coffee he never finished, and walked the same perimeter of a ranch that was too large for one man and too quiet for any living thing to want to stay in. 6 years. 6 years since the fever took her and the boy both, within 10 days of each other. People in town had come with food and condolences, and eventually, when he didn't improve, with carefully worded suggestions that he sell the property and move somewhere smaller, somewhere a man didn't have to be alone with so much empty land. He hadn't sold. He didn't know if that was strength or stubbornness or simply the inability to imagine doing anything different. Margaret had loved this land. Thomas had taken his first steps on the porch. Some mornings, Caleb could still hear the boy's laugh carried in on the wind, and he knew that was grief talking, not truth, but he held on to it anyway. The barn door was frozen shut. It had been frozen shut for 6 weeks, so when he heard the sound coming from inside it on Thanksgiving morning, his first thought was animal. A fox that had somehow gotten in through a gap in the boards. A raccoon. Something small and desperate and alive in a way that made noise without thinking about consequences. He stood in the yard for a long moment, coffee in hand, and listened. It wasn't a fox. He set the cup on the porch rail and walked toward the barn, his boots breaking through the thin crust of snow with every step. The cold that morning was the kind that made the inside of your nose ache, that made the air feel like something you had to push through rather than breathe. He had lived in Wyoming long enough to understand that cold like this didn't negotiate. It simply won, eventually, against everything. He pulled the barn door open with both hands, putting his weight against it, and the ice along the frame cracked and gave all at once. He stumbled slightly, caught himself. Inside it was dark, and for a moment he could only hear, not see, what he'd found. The baby's cry was thin and high and exhausted, the kind of cry that comes after a child has been crying for so long they have nearly given up on being heard. And beneath it, lower, something he almost missed, the sound of a woman trying to breathe quietly through pain. "Hello," he said. His voice came out rough. He hadn't spoken aloud yet that morning. A silence. Then, from the far corner behind the old feed stall, please don't call anyone." He found her by following the voice. She was in the corner where he used to store the extra hay before he'd let the cattle numbers drop. She'd pulled what remained of it around herself and the baby, an instinct more than a plan, trying to create whatever insulation she could from the frozen ground and the walls that had been slowly surrendering to the cold since October. She was wearing a coat that wasn't heavy enough for the weather she'd walked through, and her boots, he could see even in the dim light, had split at the left sole. She was young. That was the first thing that hit him, before the fear in her face or the baby in her arms. She was young in a way that made the situation feel more wrong than it already was, because no one that young should look that used up. "I'm not going to call anyone," Caleb said. She didn't believe him. He could see that plainly. She pulled the baby tighter, which made the baby cry harder, and she flinched at her own movement, a flinch that told him everything he needed to know about the kind of pain she was managing. Not the cold. Something else. "How long have you been in here?" She didn't answer right away. She was watching his hands. He realized he'd kept them at his sides without thinking about it, and he understood why that mattered to her now. Since before it got light, she finally said. He did the math. It was past 7 now. That meant she'd been in here at least 2, maybe 3 hours, in a barn that offered shelter from wind but nothing against the temperature. The baby was bundled in what looked like a blanket and a flannel shirt both, but still. Can the baby feel her feet? He asked. The woman blinked. Of all the questions she'd apparently expected, that wasn't one of them. I've been rubbing them, she said, every few minutes. She need a doctor? No. The answer came fast, too fast. Then quieter. I don't know, maybe. I can't go somewhere people will ask questions. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the baby, who had settled into the exhausted hiccuping that followed a long cry. Tiny face red and creased, eyes shut tight, like the world was something to resist. There's a wood stove in the kitchen, he said. Coffee's on. You can come inside and we'll figure out the rest after. I'm not... She stopped. Started again. I'm not looking for charity. I know. And I can't stay long. I just needed somewhere to rest. I didn't know the barn was yours. I just saw it and it's fine, Caleb said. Come inside. You don't know me. No, he agreed. But you've been in a frozen barn for 3 hours with a newborn, and I've got a warm house 40 feet away, so let's have that argument later. She looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that's trying to read a person's whole character in the span of a few seconds, because that's all the time available, because the stakes are too high to get it wrong. Whatever she saw, it was enough. She let him help her up. He was careful about it, offered his arm rather than taking her, let her grip him rather than gripping her. And she managed to stand, and the sound she made when she shifted the baby's weight told him the rib situation was worse than she'd let on. They walked across the yard together in the cold, the woman moving slowly and Caleb adjusting his pace without comment, and he opened the kitchen door and stood aside to let her through first. She stopped in the doorway. The kitchen was plain. A single man's kitchen, functional, not warm, the kind of space where someone cooked because they had to, not because they wanted to. But the stove was going, and the coffee was there, and whatever she'd been breathing in that barn, this was different. She walked in. Caleb closed the door behind them. Tip. Her name was Alara Voss, and she told him this about 20 minutes later after she'd settled in the chair nearest the stove with the baby against her chest, and a cup of coffee she kept forgetting to drink going cold on the table beside her. She didn't offer the name easily. It came out slowly, like she was deciding even as she said it whether it was safe to say. He hadn't asked. He'd just put the coffee down and gone back to the stove to check on the water he'd set to heat, and she'd said it. My name is Alara. Like she needed him to know that she was a real person, not just a problem he'd found in his barn. Caleb, he said, without turning around. Caleb Whitmore. The baby's name was Clara. 4 weeks old, not 4 days as he'd first thought. He'd underestimated how small newborns were, having not been around one since Thomas. Clara had dark hair and her mother's way of going quiet suddenly, like she'd heard something she was trying to identify. Alara didn't volunteer anything else, and Caleb didn't push. He made her eat, put bread and butter on the table and said, "You need to eat," in the same flat tone he used to use with his ranch hands when they tried to skip meals during heavy work. And she ate, mechanically at first, then with the focused intensity of someone who had been hungrier than they'd admitted. After a while she said, "Are you married?" "Widower," he said. She looked around the kitchen like she was seeing it differently now. "I'm sorry," she said. "Long time ago." He was quiet for a moment. "Kids?" She looked down at Clara. "I meant..." He stopped. "Never mind." "You had children," she said. Not a question. "A son. He died with his mother." The silence that followed was the kind where two people sit with something too large and too painful to hand to each other and instead just acknowledge it from a distance. "I'm sorry," Alara said again. And then, after a moment, "I didn't know the barn was yours. I want you to know that. I wasn't trying to take advantage. I know. I saw the fence line and I thought if I could just get through the night somewhere with walls, I could figure out what came next in the morning." "How far did you walk?" She looked at the table. I don't know exactly. A few days? Caleb set his coffee down. In this weather, with a newborn. I didn't have a choice. He didn't argue with that because he could see that she meant it absolutely. He sat there instead and tried to calculate, from the split boot and the state of her coat and the specific kind of exhaustion that had settled into her face. Not just tired, but depleted, the kind that comes from sustained fear. How far a woman could walk in 3 days in Wyoming winter with a baby she was keeping alive through sheer will. Far enough, apparently. You're safe here, he said. She looked up. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out simply, the way true things sometimes do when you stop thinking about how they'll land. I don't know how long that's true for, she said. There's someone who'll be looking. I figured. He has money. He has connections. He's not the kind of person who lets things go. Neither am I, Caleb said. She studied him. He was aware of what she was doing, the same assessment as in the barn, trying to read him. And he let her look, because he understood that for a woman in her position, reading people correctly wasn't a skill, it was survival. You don't know what you're agreeing to, she said. Probably not. He stood, picked up his coffee cup. But you and Clara are staying here until you're rested and warm and the baby's healthy. What comes after that, we figure out after. Elara opened her mouth, closed it. For a moment she looked very young, and very close to something she was working hard not to let happen in front of him. Why? She asked. He stood at the sink and looked out the window at the frozen yard, the barn where she'd spent the night, the sky that was the flat gray of a Wyoming winter morning. Because someone should have helped you before it got this far, he said. And nobody did. The first week was difficult in the specific way that happens when two people who don't know each other are suddenly sharing the small architecture of daily life. Caleb was a man of established habits, and he was the first to admit that wasn't a compliment. He woke at 5:30. He liked his coffee strong and his breakfast plain, and he ate standing up at the counter because there was no one to sit down with, so sitting down had come to feel like a ceremony he couldn't justify. He talked to himself sometimes when he was working. Not conversations exactly, more like the habit of narrating tasks that you picked up living alone. And he was aware this was not normal, and he did it anyway. Elara was not a disruption, exactly. She was a presence, and presence was something the house had been missing long enough that even a quiet, careful presence registered as significant. She moved through his kitchen gently, as if she was afraid to take up space, and she cleaned things without being asked, which he thought came from the same instinct, the training of living under someone who noticed disorder and made it her problem. He noticed the way she positioned herself in a room, always with her back to a wall where possible, always facing the door. He noticed the way she went still when she heard an unfamiliar sound outside. He didn't comment on any of it. Clara slept in the spare room, which he'd cleaned out on the second day, dusting and airing it out and finding in the back of the closet a folded quilt that Margaret had made, a green and cream pattern, and debating with himself for a long moment before putting it on the bed. It was a quilt meant to be used. Margaret would have been the first one to say so. He found a wooden crate in the workshop and patted it with the quilt folded triple and set it beside the bed, and Elara looked at the makeshift cradle for a long time without saying anything. I can find something better, Caleb said. No, she said. This is good. Clara slept in the crate, Elara slept in the spare room, and Caleb slept in his room down the hall, and at 2 and 4 and 6 in the morning the baby's cry would travel through the walls, and he would lie there and listen to the sound of Elara moving to quiet her. It was the most alive his house had felt in 6 years. He didn't know what to do with that, so he just let it be true. On the 5th day, the rib gave her real trouble. He'd suspected it was broken rather than bruised from the beginning. The way she moved, the specific spots she avoided pressing, but she'd managed it quietly enough that he'd let her manage it. On the 5th day, she came downstairs in the morning, gray-faced and moving like every breath was a negotiation, and he said, "Sit down." And she sat, and he said, "Tell me how bad." And she told him. 2 ribs, she thought, maybe 3. They'd been broken 3 weeks ago. He didn't ask how. He didn't need to. He'd set enough bones and wrapped enough injuries over the years. Ranching was not a careful occupation. To know what to do with a rib, which was mostly to keep it supported and give it time and manage the fact that breathing remained non-optional. He wrapped her ribs properly, not speaking while he did it, and she held herself perfectly still with the determined stillness of someone who had learned to endure being touched when she didn't want to be. When he finished, he stepped back and she let out a careful breath. "Thank you," she said. "You should have said something. I've been managing." "I know you have." He looked at her directly. "You don't have to manage everything alone in this house." She looked at him like that sentence was in a language she understood individually, but couldn't quite parse as a full thought. He left it there. He didn't push. Later, after she'd fed Clara and settled her, and had another cup of the coffee she kept forgetting to finish, she found him in the barn replacing a hinge on the gate latch, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before saying anything. "His name is Marcus Vale," she said. Caleb kept working, let her come to it at her own pace. "He's from Laramie originally. His family has land there. He's the kind of person who other people think highly of, because they only see the part he wants them to see." She paused. "He's not going to stop looking." "How long were you with him?" 2 years. She stopped, started again. "I had nothing when I met him. My father died and left debts, not money, and Marcus was kind at first, very kind. I thought." Another pause, and the pause held everything she'd thought and been wrong about. "It doesn't matter what I thought. It changed." "When?" "Before the wedding was over," she said quietly. Caleb set down the wrench. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her, and she held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who had decided she was done apologizing for what had happened to her. "He'll have people looking," she said. "Investigators, probably. He has the means. And he'll come himself eventually, because he's not the kind of man who can tolerate being defied. It's not even about me, really. It's about the fact that I left." "I understand men like that," Caleb said. "Then you understand that you're putting yourself in a difficult position by helping me." "I understood that on Thanksgiving morning," he said. "I'm still here." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "Why?" she said again. The same question as before, but different now. Not suspicious, just genuinely trying to understand. Caleb picked up the wrench again, turned back to the hinge. "I had a boy," he said. "Thomas. He was 3 years old. There wasn't anything in the world that could have happened to him that I wouldn't have taken that on myself to prevent it." He worked the bolt. "I think about the people who should have helped his mother before she needed help. Didn't always think that. Took some years. But I think it now." Ilara was quiet. "Clara needs her mother alive and whole," he said. "So whatever's coming, we face it, that's all." He heard her exhale. Not a sigh. More like something she'd been holding for a long time, finally being set down. She didn't say anything else. She went back inside. But she started talking after that. Not about Marcus, not at first. Smaller things. The town she'd grown up in. Her father, who was a gentle and impractical man who had loved her but hadn't known how to protect her. The winter when she was 12 and the river froze solid enough that kids walked across it on a dare. And Caleb, who had spoken mostly to himself for 6 years, started listening. And then, slowly, started talking back. The first stranger from town appeared on the 9th day. Not Marcus. Not an investigator. Just a neighbor. Hester Grange, who ran the dry goods with her husband Burl and who had known Caleb for going on 12 years and felt she had certain rights that came with that familiarity. Caleb was at the fence on the east side of the property when her wagon came up the road, and he walked to the gate to meet her because he'd learned that Hester didn't come out this far without something specific on her mind. She looked at the house, then at him. "Heard you've got a woman staying with you," she said. "News travels fast." "This is a small place, Caleb. You know how it is." She adjusted the reins. "Who is she?" "Someone who needed help." "Where's she from?" "Somewhere east." Hester made a sound in her throat that communicated several things at once: skepticism, disapproval, the particular frustration of a person who expected more information and wasn't getting it. "People are talking," she said. "People generally do." "Caleb." Her voice shifted into something more direct. "You're a widow man with a woman in your house that nobody knows. You understand how that looks." "I understand how some people will choose to see it," he said. "That's a different thing." "You could at least tell me something. Where's she headed? Has she got family? What happened to her?" Caleb looked at her steadily. Hester wasn't unkind. He knew that, had always known that. But kindness and the instinct to manage the social order of a small community were two things that could sit inside the same person without ever quite reconciling. She needed help, he said again. She got it. That's all I've got for you, Hester. Hester studied him for a moment. Then she looked at the house again. She married? Complicated situation. That's not a no. No, he agreed. It's not. She gathered the reins. You're going to have trouble, she said. Not angry. Just saying a true thing in the way you said true things to someone you'd known long enough to be honest with. I've had trouble before, Caleb said. I'm still here. She left. He watched the wagon until the road bent it out of sight, and then he stood there a moment longer, his breath visible in the cold air, looking at his house. From inside, distantly, he could hear Clara making the small sounds that preceded actual crying, the warming up, the working toward it. And before she got there, the sound stopped. Alara had heard her. He walked back toward the house. He understood what Hester meant. He understood how the town would process this, what conclusions they would draw, what judgments would follow. A widow man in an isolated ranch with a strange woman and her infant, no explanation offered, circumstances unclear. He'd spent 6 years worrying about far less important things. He went inside. The letter came on the 14th day. It arrived at the post in town, addressed to current resident or occupant, Whitmore property, which meant someone had already identified whose barn Alara had found shelter in. Caleb picked it up on his regular trip for supplies and read it standing at the counter while the postmaster pretended not to watch. It was brief. Formally written, professional. It identified the sender as a firm of inquiry agents retained by a private client. Marcus's name wasn't on the paper, but it didn't need to be. And it indicated that they had reason to believe a woman named Alara Vale, née Voss, and her infant daughter had been in contact with Caleb Whitmore of this property, and that the client was deeply concerned for the welfare and whereabouts of both. Deeply concerned. Caleb folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, said nothing to the postmaster, and drove the wagon home. He gave Alara the letter that evening. She read it at the kitchen table, and the color drained out of her face in the steady way of someone who had been expecting the blow, but still felt it land. He found me, she said. He found the property, Caleb said. Not the same as finding you. He'll come. Probably. She put the letter on the table. Her hands were steady, which he suspected took effort. Clara was asleep in the back room and the house was very quiet, and outside the wind had picked up enough to make the eaves sound like low conversation. I could go, she said. I could take Clara and go before… Where? She stopped. Where would you go, Alara? In the winter, with a 5-week-old. She didn't answer because there wasn't one. She had run as far as she could run. She'd made it from wherever Marcus Vale had planted her to a frozen barn in Caleb Whitmore's yard, and that had taken everything she had. There was no further to go. He watched her understand this. He watched her sit with it, the way she sat with hard things. Not collapsing, but not pretending either, just registering the weight of it. So what do we do? She asked. Caleb thought of Thomas. He thought of Margaret. He thought of 6 years of maintaining a property alone because he hadn't been able to figure out what else to do with himself, and how in the space of 2 weeks, a woman and her baby had made his house into something that felt like it was being lived in again. We stay, he said, and when he comes, we deal with it. She looked at him. You said he won't let this go, Caleb continued. You're right. Men like that don't, but running doesn't stop them either. It just changes the location where it ends. He met her eyes. So it ends here, on my land, where I've got some say in how it goes. Alara was very still. This isn't your fight, she said. You're in my house, Caleb said, with a 5-week-old who sleeps in a crate I built out of scrap wood and Margaret's quilt. He paused. It's my fight. Outside, the wind pressed against the house, and the fire in the stove popped and settled, and Clara made a small sound in the back room that drifted through the walls and filled the quiet space between them. Alara reached across the table and picked up the letter. She folded it carefully and set it down again. Okay, she said. Just that. Quiet and certain, like a door closing on a room she'd been trying to leave for a long time. Okay, he said. They sat together in the kitchen of a too-quiet house that was slowly, improbably, against all the weight of what they'd each survived, beginning to sound like something worth defending. and outside the snow came down, steady and indifferent, covering the tracks that led from the road to the barn to the front door, the way snow covered everything in Wyoming, not erasing what had happened, but laying something clean and white over it, and leaving what came next entirely up to the people inside. The letter sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before Alara stopped looking at it every time she walked past. She didn't throw it away. Caleb noticed that. She'd folded it and set it beside the salt cellar, and it stayed there like a stone someone had brought in from outside, small and heavy and belonging to a different world than the one that existed inside these walls. He thought about putting it in the stove himself, burning the thing, but he understood that wasn't his call to make. The letter wasn't his. The fear it represented wasn't his. And Alara had survived this long by keeping a clear picture of what was coming, and destroying the evidence of it wouldn't help her do that. So it stayed. And she cooked. And Clara grew, visibly, daily, the way newborns do in those first weeks when the body is working so hard at the basic business of becoming that you can almost see it happening in real time. Clara had started tracking movement with her eyes. She'd done it first with the lamp flame set, turned her head toward the light with that blank, focused intensity of new things, discovering that the world had more in it than the inside of a woman's coat. And Alara had made a sound, small and involuntary, watching her. Not quite a laugh, not quite a cry. Something in between that had no name. Caleb had been at the table with his coffee when it happened. He hadn't said anything. He'd just watched the woman watch her daughter and thought about the morning Thomas had grabbed his finger for the first time, and how that had felt like an entire conversation conducted without words. Some things stayed with you. He'd stopped being surprised by which ones. On the 17th day, Hester Grange came back, this time with her husband. Burl Grange was a large, slow-moving man who had the reputation in town of being fair and the separate, less charitable reputation of being easily managed by his wife. Caleb liked him well enough. They'd worked together on a fence dispute the previous spring, and Burl had proven himself straightforward and practical, which were the two qualities Caleb valued most in people. The fact that Hester did most of his thinking for him was simply a feature of that particular marriage, and not Caleb's business. They came up the road in the late morning, the wagon loaded with nothing, which meant this wasn't a supply trip. Caleb met them at the gate. "Caleb," Burl said, by way of greeting. "Burl. Hester." Hester's eyes went to the house before she'd fully stopped the wagon. "Is she inside?" "You came to see me," Caleb said. "So let's talk about me." Hester gave him the look she reserved for people who were making things unnecessarily difficult. "There's talk," she said, "more than before. People are saying, I know what people are saying. Then you know it's getting worse." She set the brake on the wagon. "Someone from Laramie came through 2 days ago, asking at the post at the general store, asking about a woman with a baby." Caleb kept his face still. "What did people say?" "Some said nothing, some said enough." She looked at him directly. "Caleb, if this woman is in some kind of trouble, she is." The bluntness of it stopped her. "She's in serious trouble," he said. "And she's in my house, and she's going to stay there. That's not up for discussion." Burl cleared his throat. The man asking around described himself as working for a private client, said the woman had abandoned a marriage and taken a child. "The child is hers," Caleb said, "born to her." He didn't say otherwise, said the husband was concerned. "The husband broke 3 of her ribs," Caleb said, "before the baby was a month old." The silence that followed that was of a different quality than the silences before it. Burl looked at his hands, Hester looked at Caleb, and something shifted in her face. Not dramatic, not sudden, but the slow adjustment of a person recalculating what they thought they understood. "You're certain of that," she said. "I wrapped them myself." Another silence. "People are going to keep talking," Hester said finally. Her voice had changed. The edge of social enforcement was gone, replaced by something more direct and less comfortable. "And that man is still asking around. I don't know how long it is before—" "I know," Caleb said. "I'm not asking anyone to solve it. I'm just telling you where I stand." Hester looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the house again. "The baby healthy?" she asked. The question came out differently than her earlier ones, softer, pointed in a different direction. "Growing fast," Caleb said. "Stubborn. Looks like her mother." Hester made a sound that was almost a laugh, though she seemed to decide against finishing it. "All right," she said. She picked up the reins. All right. She didn't say anything else. She turned the wagon around and Burl gave Caleb a single nod, the kind that communicated more than the words that would have gone with it, and they went back down the road. Caleb stood at the gate for a while after, watching the wagon diminish. He wasn't certain what Hester would do with what he'd told her. He wasn't certain it would help. But he'd noticed something over the years, that the truth, stated plainly and without decoration, sometimes did work that nothing else could do. Not always. Not fast enough. But sometimes. He went back inside. Alara was at the window. She'd seen the wagon from where she stood. That was your neighbor, she said. Hester Grange. Yes. What did she want? He told her about the man from Laramie. He watched her face as he said it. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. She just listened with the careful attention of someone building a mental map of how much time they had. He's getting closer, she said. He's still in town. He hasn't come out here yet. He will. Yes, Caleb said. He will. She turned from the window. Clara was on the blanket on the floor behind her, on her back, working her fists in the air with enormous purpose. Alara looked at her daughter for a moment, and the expression on her face was the complicated thing he'd seen before. Love and fear occupying the same space in a way that didn't resolve cleanly. I keep thinking, she said, if I'd found a way to leave sooner, before she was born, before I was so... She stopped. Before you were so broken down it was hard to think straight, Caleb said. She looked at him. That's what he was doing, Caleb said. The ribs, the isolation, whatever else. It's not about anger. Men like that, it's about making sure you can't see a way out, can't think clearly enough to find one. He paused. You found one anyway. Barely. Still counts, he said. Barely still counts. She looked back at Clara. The baby had grabbed her own foot, apparently by accident, and was staring at it with profound confusion. Alara almost smiled. Almost. What happened next came not from Marcus Vale or his investigators, but from the town itself, and it came in the specific shape of a Sunday. Caleb didn't go to services, hadn't in years, had no particular interest in resuming. But the social hour that followed services was when the small machinery of community opinion got its real work done, and he was aware that he and Alara had become a topic of that machinery. He felt it when he went to town for supplies 2 days after Hester's visit. Not hostility exactly, but a calibrated distance, eyes that found other things to look at, conversations that found natural pauses just as he arrived. He bought what he needed and said what needed to be said and drove home without letting any of it show. But Alara knew. She could read it off him the way she read most things, quietly, without making a production of it. And that evening she said, "The town's against us." Part of it, he said, the part that matters. He considered how to answer that honestly. The part that's going to talk, he said, that's not the same as the part that matters. In a small community it might be. She wasn't wrong, he knew that. Social pressure in a place this size wasn't abstract. It had weight, it had teeth. It could make supplying a ranch difficult, could make selling cattle difficult, could make the daily small necessities of life into a series of obstacles. Marcus Vale hadn't even arrived yet, and he was already working through the community the way someone who understood power worked. Not through direct force, but through the structures that already existed, tilting them quietly in his direction. He's smart, Caleb said. Very. And patient. When it serves him. She was nursing Clara, looking at the fire in the stove. He'll use the patience until he can't anymore. When he gets here, and he will get here, he won't negotiate. Neither will I, Caleb said. She looked at him. I'm not saying you should. Then what are you saying? She thought about it for a moment. I'm saying you should know what you're up against. I spent 2 years learning what he is. He's not a man who makes scenes. He's not loud. He doesn't threaten in public. He'll come here and he'll be perfectly reasonable, perfectly controlled, and he'll make me sound like a woman who had a breakdown and ran with a baby in a moment of delusion, and he'll make you sound like someone who took advantage of a vulnerable woman's state. She paused. And some people will believe him, because he's very, very good at being believed. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. He thought about what she'd described, the specific kind of intelligence that manifested not as wisdom or capability, but as the perfected management of how other people perceived you. What does he want? Caleb said. Really? Under all of it. Alara looked at Clara. Control, she said. That's all it ever was. Control. She adjusted the baby against her. He doesn't love me. I think he thought he did, at first, or thought what he felt was love because it felt big enough. But it was just need. The need to have something that was his, that reflected well on him, that didn't have thoughts he hadn't approved. The fire popped. Outside, the wind was doing its usual work against the walls. When that stopped being true, she said, when I started having thoughts he didn't approve of, he found other ways to manage it. She said it flatly, not performing pain, not asking for anything, just the simple statement of what had happened. And eventually I stopped having many thoughts at all. That's what I'm most angry about, actually. Not the ribs. Not the rest of it. The fact that I got so small inside my own head. Caleb didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would improve on the honesty of what she'd just offered. You're not small now, he said finally. She looked at him. It was a direct look, and it held something he hadn't seen in it before. Something that wasn't quite trust yet, but was moving in that direction the way the temperature moved towards something livable in late March. Slowly, with setbacks, but moving. I'm getting less small, she said. Clara finished nursing and made a specific noise of completion. Alara shifted her, lifted her, and the baby immediately grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair. Oh no, Alara said, in a voice so different from the one she'd just been using, lighter, exasperated, genuinely surprised, that Caleb almost didn't recognize it. She worked the small fingers loose. You cannot do that. Clara looked up at her with the absolute absence of remorse unique to infants. Caleb laughed. An actual laugh, which caught him by surprise the way genuine things sometimes did. Alara looked at him with an expression that was half irritation and half something warmer, and Clara took the opportunity to grab her hair again. The investigator came on a Wednesday. He arrived in a hired coach, which announced him before he did. There were exactly 3 people in the county who traveled by hired coach, and none of them were people Caleb expected to see on his road. He was at the woodpile when the coach came up, and he set down the axe and waited. The man who stepped out was perhaps 50, wearing a coat that cost more than Caleb's winter supply budget. He had the careful, unhurried manner of someone paid to project confidence, and he looked at the ranch with professional assessment before he looked at Caleb. Mr. Whitmore, he said. Not a question. That's right. My name is Aldous Crane. I represent the interests of Marcus Vale. He produced a card from his coat pocket and held it out. Caleb didn't take it. Crane tucked it back. I'm sure you've had some indication that we'd be reaching out. Letter came a couple weeks back, Caleb said. Yes. We haven't had a response. No, Caleb agreed. You haven't. Crane took this without any change in expression. He was good at his job, whoever was paying him. Mr. Whitmore, I'm not here to cause any difficulty. I'm simply hoping to resolve a situation that has caused my client considerable distress. He's deeply concerned about the welfare of his wife and child. His wife left him, Caleb said. Took her child with her. That seems like a decision she made. A decision made under extreme emotional stress, Crane said carefully. We have reason to believe Mrs. Vale was not in a stable state when she left. The concern is for her well-being and the child's. She seems stable to me. Mr. Whitmore, she's not here, Caleb said. Crane paused. A small pause, professionally managed. I see. I found a woman in my barn about 3 weeks back. She needed help. I helped her. She moved on. He held Crane's gaze. I don't know where she is. Crane looked at him for a long moment. He was, Caleb suspected, quite skilled at distinguishing truth from performance, which meant he knew exactly what he was being given. But knowing someone was lying and being able to do anything about it were 2 different problems. If you do come into contact with Mrs. Vale, Crane said, I'd encourage you to reach out to my firm directly. He paused with the delicacy of someone selecting the right word. There's a finder's fee being offered for information that leads to Mrs. Vale's safe return. I'll keep that in mind, Caleb said. Crane looked at the house. One long, assessing look. Mr. Whitmore, he said, and his voice had changed, just slightly, the professional warmth dialed down to something cooler underneath. Mr. Vale is a man of considerable resources. He takes the welfare of his family very seriously. I'd simply encourage you to consider carefully what position you'd like to be in should this matter proceed legally. I'll consider it, Caleb said. Is there anything else? Crane held his gaze for a 3 count. Then he nodded, a small, precise nod, and returned to the hired coach. Caleb stood at the woodpile and watched it go down the road and out of sight. Then he went inside. Alara was in the kitchen, standing at the counter, perfectly still. She'd watched from the window. She'd heard enough. He knows, she said. He suspects, Caleb said. He can't prove anything. He'll tell Marcus. Yes. Marcus will come himself. Yes, Caleb said. He will. She turned to face him. Her face was composed, the way it went when she was working hard at not showing what was happening underneath. But her hands, she'd pressed them flat on the counter behind her, and he could see the tension in them. Caleb, she said, I need you to hear something. I'm listening. Whatever he says when he comes, and he'll say things designed to make you doubt what I've told you, I need you to know that I have not lied to you about anything, not one thing. Everything I've told you about Marcus is true, and he will tell you the opposite, and he'll tell it in a way that sounds completely reasonable. I know, Caleb said. You say that now. I'll say it when he's standing in my yard too, Caleb said. Because I've had 3 weeks of watching you with your daughter, and whatever Marcus Vale is going to say, it won't be able to undo that. She looked at him. Her hands were still pressed flat on the counter. I'm scared, she said, simply, without decoration. That's fair, he said. This is a scary situation. I've been scared for 2 years. I'm tired of it. I know. He stood there for a moment. But being scared of the right things is different from being scared of the wrong ones. You were scared of him in his house, with no way out, and no one who knew where you were. This is different. How? Because you're not alone anymore, he said, and he doesn't know yet what that means. She held his gaze. Something in her face shifted. Not relief, not resolution, something smaller and more durable than either of those things. A kind of settling. The way a foundation settled, not soft, but solid, adjusting to bear weight properly. Clara made a sound from the back room. The warming up sound. The working toward crying sound. Alara pushed off the counter. She walked toward the back room, and as she passed him, she stopped, just for a moment, and said, Thank you, Caleb, in the quiet, specific way of someone who means something larger than the words available for it. He stood in the kitchen after she'd gone and listened to the sound of her voice with the baby. Low, steady, the particular register mothers found for speaking to children who needed calming. And outside, the gray afternoon light was doing what afternoon light did in November, which was failing early and without much ceremony. He put another log in the stove. The town's position crystallized over the following week in a way that was both predictable and disheartening. Not everyone turned. That was the more accurate thing to say. Not that the town turned against them, but that the town divided, and in the way of small communities under the pressure of a compelling outside narrative, the division happened partly along lines of who you already were before it started. The men who'd never much liked Caleb, who found his self-sufficiency irritating or his refusal to participate in certain social rituals off-putting, found reasons to discuss his situation in terms of propriety and community standards. The women whose opinions of him had been shaped by Margaret, who'd been liked by essentially everyone, were quieter and harder to read. Hester Grange said nothing public. That, Caleb thought, was its own kind of statement. What broke the silence, not dramatically, not in the way of a turning point in a story, but in the grinding, unglamorous way that real things shifted, was a Tuesday afternoon at the general store when Caleb was paying for flour and a man named Dex Coulter said, loudly enough to carry, that some men had enough trouble keeping their own accounts straight without taking in other men's problems or other men's wives. The store went quiet. Caleb set his money on the counter. He picked up the flour. Clara Whitmore weighed 6 pounds, 3 ounces at birth, he said, without looking at Coulter. In November, in Wyoming. He turned. You want to tell me what a man with enough trouble keeping his accounts straight is supposed to do when he finds a woman and a 6-pound baby in a frozen barn on Thanksgiving morning? Coulter said nothing. Because I'll tell you what I did, Caleb said. I opened my house, and I'd do it again. And if anyone in this room has a different idea about what the right call was, I'd genuinely like to hear it. The room stayed quiet. He left. He was 3 blocks from the store before the sound of his own heartbeat settled down to something normal. He wasn't a man who made speeches. He'd never been comfortable with that particular form of self-expression. But something about Coulter's voice, the particular comfort with which he'd said what he said, had reached somewhere past Caleb's usual self-management. He sat in the wagon for a moment before picking up the reins. What had shifted, he thought, was something he hadn't quite allowed himself to identify until now. This had stopped being purely about doing the right thing in an abstract sense. Somewhere in 3 weeks of early mornings and kitchen conversations and the sounds of a baby growing in the back room of his house, it had become personal in a way he hadn't budgeted for and wasn't sure what to do with. He picked up the reins and drove home. Elara was in the yard when he got back, which surprised him. She'd been staying close to the house, not going outside unless necessary. But the afternoon had turned slightly, brought a thin bar of sunlight across the yard, and she was standing in it with Clara bundled against her chest, her eyes closed, her face turned up. He climbed down from the wagon, and she heard him and opened her eyes. "There was sun," she said, slightly defensive, as if she expected him to say something practical about it. "There was," he agreed. She looked at him. "What happened in town?" "Nothing serious." He took the flour out of the wagon. "Dex Coulter said something stupid, and I said something back." "What did you say?" He told her. She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." "It'll make things harder with him." "Coulter? Probably." "Caleb. Elara." He stopped at the porch steps. "I'm not going to stand in the general store and let a man talk about you and Clara like you're a liability I took on by accident." He paused. "You're not a liability." She stood in the thin bar of November sunlight with her daughter against her chest, and she looked at him with that expression he was starting to recognize. Not soft, not sentimental, but clear. The expression of someone seeing something accurately and choosing to acknowledge it. "I know I'm not," she said, and the way she said it, steady, without qualification, was different from how she might have said it 3 weeks ago. He went inside. She stood in the sun a moment longer, and Clara made a small sound against her chest, and the wind came across the yard and lifted a strand of her hair and set it back, and none of it was anything, just an ordinary November moment on a Wyoming ranch. But she stayed out in it until the sun was gone. Marcus Vale arrived on a Friday. Caleb knew it before he saw the man, the way you knew certain things on a ranch. Not through any particular sense, but through the accumulation of small signals that your body registered before your mind caught up. The hired coach was back, but this time there were 2 horses alongside it, ridden by men whose posture said they weren't there for conversation. The coach itself was better than Crane's had been. Heavier. The kind of conveyance that announced money not as aspiration, but as simple fact. Caleb was on the porch when they came up the road. He'd been mending a harness strap, and he set it down and stood, and he didn't go inside to tell Elara because she was already at the window. He'd seen her move there the moment the coach appeared at the bend. He stood on the porch and waited. Marcus Vale stepped out of the coach, and Caleb understood immediately what Elara had meant when she said he was not a man who made scenes. He was perhaps 40, well-dressed without being showy about it, and he moved with the contained, deliberate ease of someone who had never in his adult life been required to hurry. His face was pleasant. That was the word for it. Not handsome exactly, but arranged in a way that suggested reasonableness and warmth, the kind of face that made people predisposed to trust the words coming out of it. He looked at the ranch with an expression of mild, polite concern. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. His voice was the same, measured, reasonable, carrying just enough weight to be heard without effort. "I appreciate you seeing me." "I didn't invite you," Caleb said. A small pause. Marcus absorbed this without any visible reaction. "No," he said. "You didn't. I apologize for the imposition." He looked at the house, and his expression shifted into something that read as worry, the particular worry of a husband, of a father. It was very well done. "I'm simply here because I'm concerned about my family." "Your investigator already made that point." "Yes." Mr. Crane reported back that you weren't aware of Elara's whereabouts. He said it without inflection, not accusing, just noting. "I'm hoping that situation may have changed." Caleb said nothing. Marcus took a step toward the porch, and one of the mounted men moved slightly, just slightly, and Caleb noted it without moving his eyes from Marcus. "Mr. Whitmore," I don't know what Alara has told you, Marcus said. His voice had moved into something that was almost intimate now, the tone of one reasonable man confiding in another. My wife is... She struggled after the baby came, significantly. There were periods where she wasn't entirely, where her thinking wasn't clear. He paused. Let that settle. I'm not saying this to diminish her. I'm saying it because I think you deserve to understand the full picture of the situation you've become involved in. The full picture, Caleb said. She may have told you things about our marriage that reflect a distorted view of what actually occurred. I'm not angry with her for it. It's a medical reality, what she went through. But the things she believes happened. Another pause, sorrowful now, the sorrow of a man misunderstood. I love my wife. I love my daughter. I want them home safe. Caleb looked at him. He'd been listening to every word with the specific attention he gave to things that mattered, and underneath the attention he was aware of something that might have been, in a different circumstance, almost admiration, not for the man, but for the construction. It was very good. He could see exactly how it worked, could see the gears of it, and he understood why it worked on people who hadn't spent 5 weeks watching Alara Voss move through a house like she was always calculating the distance to the nearest exit. She's not here, Caleb said. Marcus looked at him. The pleasantness in his face didn't crack, but something behind it adjusted. Mr. Whitmore. She's not here, Caleb said again. And if she were, she'd be here because she chose to be, which would make it not your business. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. The two mounted men had gone very still. I see, Marcus said, quietly. The warmth had dialed back, just a degree, just enough that if you weren't watching for it, you might not catch it. I'd be careful about the position you're taking, Mr. Whitmore. I generally am. There are legal dimensions to this situation that you may not be fully aware of. A husband's rights, in this territory. I'm aware of the law, Caleb said. I've also got a rifle inside the door, and 260 acres that begins at that fence line, and you're currently on the wrong side of it. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. The pleasantness was entirely gone now, not replaced by anything theatrical, just gone, like a lamp turned down, revealing the cooler thing underneath. I'll be in town, Marcus said, for as long as it takes. He turned back toward the coach. At the door he stopped, his hand on the frame, and looked back. I do hope we can resolve this sensibly, Mr. Whitmore, for everyone's sake. He got in the coach. The two riders held their positions for 1 beat longer than necessary. A small punctuation mark, deliberate, and then followed. Caleb stood on the porch and watched them go. His hands were steady. He noted this with some detachment. His hands were steady, but his jaw ached from the pressure he'd been holding it at without knowing, and his chest had the tight, hot feeling of anger that he'd been keeping below the surface through the entire exchange. He went inside. Alara was not at the window anymore. She was at the kitchen table, sitting with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, and Clara was in the crate in the back room making sleep sounds. The house was very quiet. You heard, he said. Enough. Her voice was even. The medical instability story. Yes. He used it before, with my father, near the end. Tried to convince him that I'd become difficult to manage because I was unwell. She said it without apparent emotion, the way you talked about whether you'd survived. My father didn't entirely believe it, but he didn't entirely not believe it either. That's what Marcus is good at. He doesn't need people to believe him completely. He just needs them to be uncertain. Caleb sat down across from her. He's going to work the town, he said. Same as he's been doing. Yes. And he's patient enough to stay until something moves. He won't wait long, she said. He can't. He's got business in Laramie, properties, dealings. A week, maybe 2. After that, it gets expensive for him to keep men out here. She looked at the table. He'll push before he leaves. Do something to force the situation. What kind of something? She was quiet for a moment. Legal, probably. He'll find a sympathetic judge or a marshal who owes him something, and he'll come back with paperwork that says he has the right to take Clara. Not me. He doesn't actually want me, not anymore. He wants the baby because the baby is his, because leaving with her is the thing that humiliated him most. She paused. If he can take Clara, he wins. Even if I stay free, he wins, because I'll spend every day of my life knowing he has her. Caleb sat with that. We need something to counter it, he said. Not a rifle, something legal. I know. She looked up. I've been thinking about it since Crane came. I need documentation, evidence of what he did, the injuries, the pattern of it, something that a judge who doesn't know Marcus Vale would look at and understand. The ribs. And more than that, I had... She stopped, and the stopping was the kind that meant she was deciding whether to continue. Before I left, I kept records, dates, what happened, exactly how. I knew he'd deny everything. I knew no one would simply take my word, so I wrote it down. She paused. In a journal, which I couldn't take when I left because I left with nothing but Clara and the clothes I had on. Where's the journal? The house in Laramie, in the chimney breast in the east bedroom behind a loose brick. She looked at him steadily. I put it there the first time he locked me in for 3 days. I thought if anything ever happened to me, at least someone would find it eventually. The house in Laramie, Marcus Vale's house, presumably now locked and staffed and very much not accessible to the woman who'd left it. We need a lawyer, Caleb said. In this town? He thought. There's a man in Cheyenne, Robert Aldis. He handled the water rights case for the Brennan family 3 years back. Brennan was up against 2 railroads and a territorial judge who'd been taking money from them, and Aldis won. He paused. He's not cheap. I have nothing, she said flatly. Not self-pitying, just accurate. I didn't ask you to pay for it, Caleb said. She looked at him in the particular way she had when he said something that made her want to argue out of principle but couldn't find fault with the logic. Caleb, Ilara, the man is in town with 2 hired riders and a plan to use the courts to take your daughter. I can either spend the winter being correct about not owing anyone anything, or I can send a telegram to Aldis tomorrow morning. He held her gaze. I know which one I'm choosing. She held his gaze. Her jaw was set in the way he'd come to recognize as her working something out, rather than resisting it. All right, she said finally. All right, he said. He sent the telegram the next morning, and Marcus Vale spent that same morning in the town of Garrison, making the rounds in a way that was so natural and unforced, it might have looked like simple sociability to someone who wasn't tracking it. Caleb heard about it from 3 different people by noon. Marcus had visited the general store where he'd spoken to the owner and several customers about his situation. Not dramatically, not demanding anything, just a husband explaining to concerned community members that his wife had suffered a breakdown after childbirth, and he was simply trying to bring her and their daughter home safely. He'd expressed gratitude to the community for any information. He'd expressed specifically and gently concern that his wife might have imposed upon the hospitality of a local rancher who perhaps hadn't understood the full picture of what he was getting involved in. At the barbershop, he'd bought a round of coffee and told a story about Ilara at a community event 2 years ago in Laramie. Warm, specific, the story of a man who remembered his wife fondly and missed her. And people had listened and nodded. At the land office, he'd asked quiet questions about the Whitmore property, its acreage, its debts, its history. Caleb heard this last part and sat with it for a moment in the wagon outside the post office, before he went inside and waited to see if Aldis had responded to the telegram. Aldis had. The response was brief and professional. He was familiar with Vale, which Caleb hadn't expected, and he would come to Garrison within 5 days. He had questions. He needed Caleb to gather what documentation he could. Caleb read it twice, folded it, and drove home. The community meeting was not something anyone officially called. It happened the way community meetings in small places often happened, organically, at the worst possible time, with the maximum potential for damage. It was the Tuesday of Marcus's 2nd week in town when Dex Coulter, whose memory of the general store incident had apparently curdled into something more purposeful, organized what he described as a community discussion about the situation at the Whitmore property. He held it at the Grange Hall, which was a communal building and therefore not something anyone could reasonably object to him using, and sent word around in the way you sent word in Garrison, which was to tell 4 people and let arithmetic do the rest. Caleb heard about it from Burl Grange, who came out to the ranch specifically to tell him, which Caleb thought was decent of him. You don't have to go, Burl said. What happens if I don't? Burl was quiet in the considering way he was quiet. Vale's been invited to speak, he said. Caleb looked at him. By Coulter. Yes. And if I'm not there? Then you're not there, Burl said. And Vale speaks, And Coulter nods along, and the people in the middle, the ones who don't know what to think, have only got the one side of it. Caleb looked at the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see the shape of Alara at the stove. "She coming?" Burl asked. "I'll ask her." He did that evening. He told her everything Burl had told him, and she listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He wants me there," she said. "That's why he agreed to the meeting. If I'm not there, he'll use my absence as evidence. If I am there, he'll try to manage me the way he always did. Talk over me, reframe everything I say, make me look unstable just by being in the same room." She paused. "He's very good at that last one." "I know," Caleb said. "But if I'm not there, I know that too." She looked at Clara, asleep in the crate, fists curled up near her face. "I'll go," she said. The Grange Hall held perhaps 60 people, and it held approximately 54 that Wednesday evening, which meant that almost everyone who'd been sent word had come, which meant that most of the functioning social body of Garrison was in one room to hear whatever was going to happen. Caleb walked in with Alara at his side, and the shift in the room's attention was immediate and complete. Not hostile exactly, not welcoming, the specific suspension of judgment that precedes watching something play out. Marcus was already there, standing near the front of the room in a posture of patient, dignified waiting, and when he saw them come in, his face did something remarkable. It expressed relief. Genuine-looking, warm, a husband seeing his wife, a man whose worry was resolving in real time. "Alara," he said. She stopped walking. Caleb stopped beside her. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was even. Not cold, not warm. Even. Coulter called the meeting to order from the front, and people settled into their seats, and the whole architecture of the evening began to arrange itself the way Marcus had designed it to arrange itself. With him at the center, the wronged party, the reasonable man, and Alara somewhere in the middle of the room as the variable element whose behavior would determine the narrative. Marcus spoke first. He spoke for perhaps 10 minutes, and it was, Caleb thought, watching the room, nearly perfect. He described a marriage that had been happy and then difficult, a wife whose mental state had deteriorated after childbirth, a husband who had tried everything he knew to help her and had been frightened when she left. He mentioned the baby twice, which was correct, enough to establish Clara's existence and his claim, not enough to seem like that was what he actually wanted. He mentioned his resources without mentioning them, by not apologizing for the hired coach and the writers, by simply being visibly the kind of man who had those things. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He expressed concern and sorrow and a hope that the community could help him bring his family home. When he finished, Coulter looked at Alara with the particular satisfaction of a man who has set a trap and is watching it spring. "Mrs. Vale," Coulter said, "would you like to respond?" And here was the thing about Marcus Vale that he'd spent 2 years teaching her without intending to. The thing he'd meant to use to control her. The systematic reduction of her confidence, her sense of her own competence, her belief in her own perceptions, had produced, as its unintended consequence, a woman who knew with absolute certainty which of her perceptions to trust. Because she'd spent 2 years watching herself be told she was wrong about things she knew she was right about, and she'd kept track of every single time, and the keeping track had been its own kind of armor. She stood up. She didn't look at Marcus. She looked at the room. At the people in it. Hester Grange in the third row, face unreadable. Burl beside her, the postmaster, the schoolteacher. A dozen farmers and their wives. People who had known each other 20 years, who would know each other for 20 more, whose opinion of what happened in this room would matter long after Marcus Vale had gone back to Laramie. "My name is Alara Voss," she said. "Not Vale. I was Alara Voss before I made a mistake, and I'm going to be Alara Voss for the rest of my life." A pause. "Mr. Vale's account of our marriage is accurate in the way that a drawing of a house is accurate. You can recognize the shape of it, but it leaves out all the things that happen inside." She was steady. Her hands were at her sides and they were not shaking, which Caleb noted because he knew what it had cost her to make that true. "I'm not going to ask you to believe me over him," she said. "I know how that works. I know that he's a man of standing, and I'm a woman who walked out of a barn looking like something the winter found. But I'm going to tell you specific things, and you can decide what to do with them." She told them. Not everything. She wasn't performing, and she had enough judgment to know that too much detail read as desperation. But enough. The first time. The progression. The 3 weeks after Clara was born. The ribs stated plainly, without drama. The date, how it happened, how many. She said it the way you stated facts that were beyond argument. Not angry, not crying, just clear and sequential. And she said, "There is a journal. In the house in Laramie. In the chimney breast of the east bedroom, behind the third brick from the left. Every date. Every incident. I wrote it in case someone needed to find the truth after I was no longer able to tell it myself." The room was very quiet. Marcus, to his credit, showed almost nothing. A slight tightening around the eyes. A breath that was a fraction too controlled. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it entirely. But Caleb was looking for it. And so was Hester Grange, who had been watching Marcus Vale's face since the moment Alara stood up, with the steady, unhurried attention of a woman who had spent 30 years running a business and reading people, and who knew what composed performance looked like from the inside. Coulter tried to recover the room. He asked Marcus if he'd like to respond to the allegations, using that word, allegations, with the specific weight of someone trying to frame the terms. Marcus said smoothly that he deeply regretted that his wife felt she had cause for these feelings, and that he hoped she would get the help she needed. "The help she needed," Hester Grange said from the third row. Coulter looked at her. "Hester, I'd like to ask Mr. Vale a question," Hester said. She was not loud. She was the opposite of loud, which in a quiet room was more effective than any volume. Coulter started to speak. Burl put a hand on Hester's arm, and she shook it off gently, not angrily, just the reflex of a woman who was going to say what she was going to say. "Mr. Vale," she said, "your wife walked through a Wyoming winter with a newborn baby, in November, in boots with a split sole." She paused. "What is a woman trying to get away from badly enough to do that?" Marcus opened his mouth. "Not what you think she was running from," Hester said. "What is a woman actually running from, to walk that far in that cold with a baby she's trying to keep alive?" The room turned and looked at Marcus Vale. Not all of it, not everyone, but enough. And Marcus, for perhaps the first time since he'd arrived in Garrison, had nothing immediately ready. They walked back to the wagon afterward in the cold dark, and Caleb didn't say anything until they'd cleared the main street and the lights of the hall had receded behind them. "You were steady in there," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "I know. You were still steady." She was quiet for a moment. "Hester," she said. "Yes." "She didn't have to do that." "No," Caleb agreed. "She didn't." The wagon moved through the dark, the horse's breath visible in the cold, and the stars overhead had the hard, bright clarity of deep winter when the air carried no moisture. "He's not going to let the journal go," she said. "He knows I told a room full of people where it is. He'll have someone at the house in Laramie by the end of the week." "Aldous will be here in 2 days," Caleb said. She nodded, but he could hear in her silence the thing she wasn't saying, that 2 days was a long time when someone with Marcus's resources was moving to destroy evidence she'd spent 2 years creating. "I need to get to Laramie," she said. "That's what Marcus wants," Caleb said immediately. "I know, but Aldous needs that journal. Without it, everything I said tonight is just a woman's word against her husband's. And Marcus has money, and I have—" She stopped. "I have a good speech?" And Hester Grange's question. He drove. The road ran dark between the trees and the open land, and the cold was the settling kind, the kind that came down after dark and was going to stay. "Not you going to Laramie," he said finally. "Someone else." "Who?" He thought about it. "Burl," he said. "Burl Grange has a cousin in Laramie. He's mentioned it. If Hester's already decided where she stands, and I think she has, then Burl will go if we ask him. He can get to the house before Marcus can get a message there." Alara considered this. He'd be taking a risk. He'll understand what he's being asked. And if Marcus finds out, then Marcus finds out, Caleb said. But right now the journal is sitting in a chimney breast, and it's the best evidence you have, and we've got maybe 48 hours before someone with a crowbar gets to it first. She was quiet. The wagon crested a small rise and the Whitmore property came into view ahead. The dark shape of the house, the light still burning in the kitchen window where he'd left the lamp, a small, warm point in all that cold dark. "Okay," she said. He brought the wagon around to the barn. She climbed down, and Clara was awake now against her chest, making the alert sounds of a baby who had been jostled into consciousness and was taking stock of the situation. "You did something tonight," Caleb said. "In there. You stood up in front of 60 people and told the truth about something that must have cost you enormously to say out loud. It needed saying." "Yes," he said, "but you still did it." She looked at him across the yard. Behind her the barn was dark, and he thought about the first morning, the sound from inside the frozen barn, how he'd almost dismissed it as an animal. "I've been trying to figure out," she said, "when I stopped being as afraid as I was." And she looked at the house, at the lamp burning in the window. "I think it was around the time someone kept a lamp on for me," she said. And then she went inside before he could respond to that, which was probably intentional, and the door closed, and through the window he could see her moving to the stove. He stood in the cold yard for a moment. Then he went to speak to Burl Grange. Burl Grange left for Laramie before dawn. Caleb had gone to him that same night, after the wagon was put up and the horses fed, and Alara had gotten Clara down with the particular exhausted efficiency of a woman running on will more than energy. He'd knocked on the Grange door at nearly 10 o'clock, which in Garrison was the equivalent of knocking at midnight, and Hester had opened it in her housecoat with the expression of a woman who had been expecting someone to knock. He'd explained what he needed. Burl had listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when Caleb finished, Burl had looked at Hester, and Hester had looked back at him in the manner of a couple who had been married long enough to conduct entire conversations with their eyes. "The chimney breast," Burl said. "East bedroom, third brick from the left." "That's what she said." "Marcus Vale will have people watching the house." "Probably, but you're not Alara. You're a man with a cousin in Laramie making a family visit. If you go now, you're there before Marcus can get a message out." Burl looked at his hands. He was a man who thought with his hands, Caleb had noticed. He held things when he was working something out, turned them over, set them down. Right now he had nothing to hold, and he was working it out anyway. "All right," he said. Hester made him take food for the road and an extra blanket and said nothing about the risk, which Caleb thought was its own kind of courage. The courage of letting someone you love do the necessary thing without making them carry your fear about it on top of everything else. Burl was on the road by 4 in the morning. Caleb knew because he heard the wagon go past on the road below the property, heading south in the dark. He lay awake after that, listening to the house, to Clara's occasional small sounds and Alara's quiet movement when she tended to her, and he thought about Robert Aldis, who was somewhere between Cheyenne and Garrison with a lawyer's case and questions. Caleb hadn't been able to answer yet in a telegram. 2 days. Maybe less if Aldis pushed the pace. Whether that was fast enough depended entirely on Marcus Vale, and Marcus Vale, as Alara had said, was patient until he couldn't afford to be. Aldis arrived the following afternoon, which was faster than expected, and suggested he'd push the pace considerably. He was a compact man in his late 40s with the kind of face that gave nothing away as a professional habit rather than a personal one. And he came into Caleb's kitchen, looked around it with the quick, comprehensive gaze of someone cataloging a situation, and sat down at the table without being invited. "Tell me everything," he said, "in order. Don't interpret, don't summarize, just what happened and when." He said this to Alara, who was sitting across from him with Clara in her arms, and Alara looked at him for a moment, reading him the way she read everyone, and then she told him everything, in order. Aldis listened with the particular intensity of a man who was not just hearing what was said, but tracking what was left out, what was said with extra care, what was said too quickly. He interrupted twice, both times to establish specific dates. He wrote nothing down while she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The journal," he said. "I've sent someone for it," Caleb said. Aldis looked at him. "Who?" "A neighbor, reliable man. He left before dawn. He'll have trouble getting into the house. He knows people in Laramie. Vale will have staff there, possibly men watching the property." "I know," Caleb said. "It was still the best option we had." Aldis tapped the table once, a single considering tap. "What else do you have, besides the journal, if we get it?" Alara said, "I have the ribs." "Caleb wrapped them," Caleb said. "I can testify to what I found." "A rancher's assessment isn't a doctor's assessment." "No, Caleb said. But I've set enough bones that I know what a healed fracture feels like versus a fresh one versus an old one. These were 3 weeks old when I found her, consistent with what she's described. Aldous considered. What else? There are people in Laramie, Ilara said carefully. A woman who worked in our house for the first year. She left because of what she saw. Her name is Ruth Daly. She has a sister in Casper. Do you know the sister's address? I know the street. That's a start. Aldous made a note, finally, on a small piece of paper he produced from his coat. Vale has filed a petition in the territorial court in Cheyenne. I saw it before I left. He filed it 3 days ago. It asked for a writ of return for the child on grounds of maternal instability and unlawful removal from the marital home. The word petition landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Ilara went very still. Clara, feeling the change in her mother's body, turned her face upward with a small questioning sound. He can't, Ilara started. He's done it, Aldous said. Not unkindly, but directly. The petition is filed. That doesn't mean it succeeds, but it means we are now operating under a deadline, because a territorial judge is going to look at this within the next 10 to 14 days and make a preliminary ruling on whether to issue the writ. What does a preliminary ruling mean? Caleb asked. It means a marshal could come to this property with legal authority to remove the child, Aldous said, pending a full hearing, which could take months. The kitchen was very quiet. Months without Clara, Ilara said. Her voice was absolutely controlled, which Caleb understood cost her more than anything else she'd done since she walked into that barn. That's what we're working to prevent, Aldous said. The journal, if it establishes a documented pattern of abuse with specific dates and incidents, gives me grounds to file a counterpetition and request an emergency injunction before the writ can be executed. It also gives me material for the full hearing that changes the character of this case from a runaway wife to a woman fleeing documented domestic violence. He looked at her steadily. The journal is important, Mrs. Voss. I know it is, she said. How confident are you that it's still there? She thought about this with the honest, careful attention she gave to things that mattered. When I left, Marcus didn't know it existed. He'd have no reason to look in the chimney breast of a room he barely used. She paused. But if he's heard what I said at the meeting, and by now he has, he'll know exactly where to look. How fast can your man get back from Laramie? 2 days at the outside, Caleb said. Possibly sooner if everything went smoothly. Aldous wrote something else. I'm going to need you to write down everything you can remember from the journal, he said to Ilara. Dates, incidents, in as much detail as you can reconstruct. If the original is gone, your written account is secondary evidence, but it's still something. Do it tonight. All right? And the woman, Ruth Daly. Write down everything you know about finding her. All right. Aldous looked at Caleb. You understand that your involvement in this, harboring her, testifying on her behalf, puts you in Marcus Vale's crosshairs as well. He'll argue you had improper motives. He'll argue your testimony is compromised. I understand that. And I don't care, Caleb said. What do you need from me? Aldous studied him for a moment with the assessing gaze he'd come in with. Your property records, deed, tax payments, anything that establishes your standing as a legitimate landholder in this territory. Vale has been asking questions about your property at the land office. He may try to complicate your situation legally as leverage. I'll get them. Good. Aldous stood, tucked the paper away. I'll stay in town. I need to send some messages tonight, and I'll be back tomorrow morning. He looked at Ilara. You did the right thing at that meeting. It was a risk, but it was the right kind of risk. You established your account publicly, with witnesses, before he could fully shape the narrative. That matters. Ilara said, Will it be enough? Aldous picked up his hat from the table. Depends on what comes back from Laramie, he said. Get some sleep if you can, both of you. He left. The kitchen settled back into its quiet. Caleb put another log in the stove and Ilara put Clara down in the crate and came back to the table and picked up a pencil and the writing paper he'd set out, and she started writing. She wrote the way she did everything focused and without self-pity, just the steady work of reconstruction, dates and incidents laid out in sequence with the clinical precision of someone who had been keeping count for a long time and knew every entry by heart. He brought her coffee. She didn't look up. He sat across the table with his property documents and sorted through them, separating what Aldous had asked for. And the fire worked against the cold outside, and Clara slept, and the two of them sat together in the late-night quiet of the kitchen and did the unglamorous, necessary work of building a defense out of whatever materials were at hand. At some point past midnight, Elara set down the pencil and pressed her fingers against her eyes. "How many pages?" Caleb asked. She counted. 11. He looked at the stack. "Is that everything?" "Everything I can be certain of the dates for. There are other things I'm less exact on. I didn't write those." "Right call," he said. She looked at him across the table. She looked tired in the deep way. Not just short on sleep, but carrying something heavy, and the carrying of it was visible in a way it hadn't been in a while. The meeting had cost her, he thought, not the speaking of it. That had been its own kind of release. But seeing Marcus's face again, hearing his voice perform concern and sorrow, having to sit in the same room with the person who'd broken 3 of her ribs while she held his daughter. "He's going to try to take her," she said. Not asking, just saying it out loud to hear how it sounded. "He's going to try," Caleb said. "And if he gets the writ, Aldous will file the injunction. And if the judge doesn't grant it?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Then we deal with that when it happens. Not before." She looked at him. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Refusing to catastrophize." "One of us has to," he said. She almost laughed. It came out small and tired, but it was real, and it changed her face for a moment into something that belonged to a different life. A life where things had gone differently from the start, where she'd had the ordinary luxury of laughing at small things without it feeling like something stolen. "Get some sleep," Caleb said. 11 pages is enough for one night." She did eventually. He sat up a while longer watching the fire, thinking about Burl. Somewhere on a dark road in Wyoming, and a journal behind a brick and a chimney breast, and a judge in Cheyenne who didn't know any of them and would have to decide something enormous based on paperwork and testimony and whatever version of the truth arrived first. He thought about Thomas, about how 3 years old was old enough to be a person, to have opinions about things, to prefer one blanket over another and insist on a specific cup and laugh at things that weren't particularly funny. He thought about how final it was, losing that, how there was no legal petition, no counterfiling, no injunction that addressed the specific, unbearable finality of it. Clara was not his daughter. He knew that precisely and completely. But she'd been sleeping in a crate he built in a room down the hall for over a month, and the thought of a marshal coming to this property with a writ of return was something he couldn't sit with for very long before he had to find something else to think about. He put out the lamp and went to bed. Burl came back the following evening. He came up the road in the last of the gray afternoon light, and Caleb saw the wagon from the porch and went to the gate and waited, and when Burl pulled up, he could see from the man's face that it hadn't been simple. "I got it," Burl said. Caleb let out a breath. "But there were men at the house," Burl said, climbing down. 2 of them, watching the front. He reached into the inside of his coat and produced a book. Not large, bound in brown cloth, the kind of journal you could buy at any general store, nondescript by design. "My cousin Fen knows the housekeeper, the woman who replaced Ruth Daly. Different woman, been there about a year. Fen talked to her. She let us in through the kitchen in the evening when the men out front couldn't see." He handed the journal to Caleb. It was lighter than he'd expected. He held it carefully, the way you held things that had cost something to get. "The housekeeper," Caleb said. "She's all right? They didn't see her?" "Fen's going to make sure she's all right," Burl said. "She's not going to say anything. He paused. "She's seen things, Caleb, working in that house. She's not going to say anything." Caleb nodded. "Thank you, Burl. I mean that." Burl looked at him steadily. "How's the woman?" "Managing." "And the baby?" "Growing," Caleb said. "Getting fat and opinionated." Burl made the sound that was his version of a laugh, short, contained. "Hester's going to want to know it went all right. Tell her it did, and tell her—" He stopped. "Just tell her thank you." He brought the journal inside and set it on the kitchen table in front of Elara, who looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then she picked it up, opened it to the first page, and closed it again immediately. "It's all there," she said. Her voice was careful. "Aldous needs it tonight," Caleb said. "I know." She set it on the table. She put her hand flat on the cover, not opening it. I haven't read it since I wrote it. I'd rather not read it again. You don't have to, Caleb said. She nodded once, took her hand off the journal, and pushed it across the table toward him. Give it to Aldous. He rode to town. Aldous was at the single boarding house Garrison offered, a narrow building on the main street that served as both inn and evening meal for travelers, and he was in the small parlor with papers spread across the table when Caleb knocked on the open door. Caleb set the journal on top of the papers. Aldous looked at it, then at Caleb. The Laramie trip. Yes. He picked it up, opened it, read the first page. His face didn't change, which was itself a kind of expression. He turned a few more pages. Sit down, he said without looking up. Caleb sat. Aldous read for perhaps 20 minutes, turning pages slowly, occasionally going back. Caleb sat with his hat in his hands and looked at the wall and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he'd developed over 6 years of being in rooms alone. Finally, Aldous set the journal down. This is substantial, he said. Enough? For the injunction, yes. For the full hearing, it depends on how the judge weights a woman's own testimony about her own situation. There are judges who find a written journal compelling and judges who find it self-serving. He paused. Ruth Daly matters, a third-party witness who worked in the house and can corroborate even 1 or 2 specific incidents changes the weight of this significantly. Can you find her? I've already sent a message to Casper. Whether she's willing to testify is a different question. She'll be afraid of Vale. Most people are, Caleb said. Doesn't mean they all do what he wants. Aldous looked at him. No, he agreed. It doesn't. He closed the journal. I'll file the counter petition and the injunction request tomorrow morning. It goes by wire to Cheyenne. The judge there, I know his record. He's not Vale's man, which is something. He's also not particularly sympathetic to what he'd call domestic irregularities, which means the framing of this matters enormously. He paused. I'm going to frame it around the child. Not Alara's freedom, not the marriage, not the abuse and isolation. The child's welfare, and what it means for a child's welfare that her mother fled in a Wyoming winter with split boots and broken ribs. Because that's the argument that works, Caleb said. Because that's the argument that's true, Aldous said. Which in this case are the same thing. Marcus Vale made his move 2 days later, and he made it in the morning, which was the choice of someone who understood the psychology of catching people when they weren't ready. Caleb was in the barn when he heard the horses. He came out to find Marcus's coach on the road outside the property gate, and alongside it, not just the 2 riders from before, but a third man in a different kind of coat, a marshal's coat, the badge catching the flat morning light. He walked to the gate. The marshal was a man named Hobart, 60s, weathered in the permanent way of men who'd spent decades outdoors. He had the uncomfortable expression of someone carrying out a duty he wasn't entirely at ease with. Mr. Whitmore, Hobart said, I've got a preliminary writ here from the territorial court in Cheyenne for the return of the infant Clara Vale to the custody of her father, Marcus Vale, pending a full hearing. He held out the document. I'm sorry to be here under these circumstances. Caleb took the document. He read it. His face stayed still. This writ was issued 2 days ago, he said. Yes, sir. There's a counter petition and an injunction request filed yesterday morning with the same court, Caleb said, by Robert Aldous of Cheyenne on behalf of Alara Voss. Are you aware of that? Hobart blinked. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but recalibration. No, sir. I wasn't informed of that. Then I'd suggest you were sent out here with incomplete information, Caleb said. He kept his voice level. Because if a counter petition and injunction request are pending before the same judge who issued this writ, then executing this writ before the judge has ruled on the injunction may constitute a prejudicial action, and I believe Robert Aldous would argue exactly that in front of that judge. He had no idea if any of what he'd just said was legally precise. He'd pieced it together from what Aldous had told him over 2 days of conversation, and he said it with the confidence of someone who was holding a rifle without necessarily being the best shot in the room. Hobart looked at the writ in Caleb's hand. Then he looked at Marcus's coach. Marcus stepped out. His face was composed and cold in a way that was different from the performance at the Grange Hall. This was the real thing, the version underneath, and it was considerably less pleasant. Marshal Hobart, Marcus said, This is a valid writ from a territorial court. Yes, sir, Hobart said. But if there's a pending injunction, an injunction that was filed less than 24 hours ago by a lawyer working for a woman who is in violation of territorial marriage law, Mr. Vale, Caleb said. Marcus looked at him. You're on the wrong side of my fence, Caleb said. You've been on the wrong side of my fence since the first day you came here. And I've been patient about it because I understand you have resources and you know how to use them, and there are things I can't prevent you from doing legally. He paused. But you're not taking that baby today, not while an injunction is pending. And if Marshal Hobart tries to execute this writ before the judge rules on that injunction, Aldous will have grounds to have every subsequent legal action you take thrown out. Hobart was looking between the two of them with the expression of a man who had come out here expecting a straightforward duty and had found instead a complicated legal situation he hadn't been briefed on. I need to confirm the filing, Hobart said finally. Before I proceed, if there's a pending injunction before the same court, he looked at Marcus. I'm sorry, Mr. Vale. I can't execute this writ if there's a pending injunction I haven't been made aware of. I need to wire Cheyenne. Marcus said nothing for a long moment. His jaw was set in the same tight way Caleb had first noticed at the Grange Hall. The small crack in the composed surface where the real thing underneath showed through. Fine, Marcus said quietly. Wire Cheyenne. Hobart looked at Caleb. I'll need a day to get a response. Possibly 2. We'll be here, Caleb said. Count. The wire from Cheyenne came the next afternoon, and it said what Aldous had believed it would say. The injunction request was under review, and the execution of the preliminary writ was stayed pending the judge's ruling on the injunction. 2 weeks, possibly 3. Aldous brought the wire out to the property himself. He sat at the kitchen table and explained what it meant, and what it didn't mean, and what came next, which was the full hearing. Still weeks away, still uncertain, still dependent on Ruth Daly, and what a judge in Cheyenne decided to believe. But today was not that day. Alara held Clara against her chest and read the wire twice, and then set it on the table, and she looked out the window at the property, the barn, the yard, the fence line, the long, empty winterland. 2 weeks, she said. At least, Aldous said, and I'm going to use those 2 weeks. He looked at her. Casper has responded. Ruth Daly is there. She's willing to talk. Alara looked at him. She's willing to testify? I didn't say testify. I said willing to talk. It's a start. He stood. I'll go to Casper. You write down everything Ruth saw, every incident she was present for, everything you think she could confirm. Give me something to work from when I speak with her. She'll be afraid, Alara said, of Marcus. Most people who've dealt with Marcus Vale are afraid of him, Aldous said. The question is whether she's more afraid of him than she is of something else. What else? Alara asked. Aldous picked up his hat. Of going the rest of her life knowing she could have said something and didn't. He paused at the door. Some people find that motivating. I'm hoping Ruth Daly is one of them. He left. Caleb stood at the window and watched the man ride back down toward town, and behind him he could hear Clara making the sound she made when she was working herself up to being hungry, and Alara moving to tend to her. The community had not resolved. That was the accurate thing. The people who'd been inclined to believe Marcus hadn't all changed their minds because of Hester's question at the Grange Hall. Coulter still held his position. There were still conversations that stopped when Caleb walked into the general store. But something had shifted in the town's relationship to the question. It had gone from a settled matter of community propriety to an unsettled one, which was different. Unsettled meant people were still thinking, still watching, still making up their minds. Hester Grange had begun bringing food out to the property on Thursdays. She'd done it once without announcement, left a covered dish on the porch, and was gone before anyone came to the door, and then done it again the following week, and by the 3rd week it was simply a thing that happened. She never mentioned it. Caleb never mentioned it. Alara had told him quietly that she thought she might like Hester Grange very much. The school teacher, a woman named Vera Marsh, who had taught in Garrison for 9 years and had the community standing that came with that, had stopped Caleb on the street the week after the meeting and said, without preamble or particular expression, "If there's anything useful I can do, tell me." He'd thanked her. He didn't know yet if there was, but he noted it. Small things. Not a tide turning, not a victory, just the slow individual accounting of people deciding what they actually believed when pushed to decide. Marcus was still in town. He'd taken rooms at the boarding house, and he was there with a purpose. And the purpose hadn't changed, even if the timetable had shifted. Caleb saw the coach in town when he went for supplies, and he noted it without reaction and did what he needed to do and went home. 2 weeks. Possibly 3. He came back from town one afternoon to find Alara on the porch, which had become something she did when the weather allowed, stood outside for a while with Clara, taking whatever thin winter sun was available. Clara had started responding to faces with something that was becoming, incrementally, a smile. Not quite yet, but almost, the muscular precursor to it, the learning of the gesture. She'd done it that morning at Caleb. He'd been drinking his coffee at the table, and she'd been watching him from her spot on the blanket on the floor, and he'd made a face at her. Involuntary, the kind of face you made at babies without deciding to. And her face had done the thing. Almost a smile, working toward it. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone, but he'd thought about it for the rest of the morning. Alara looked up when he came through the gate. "Anything in town?" she asked. "Wire from Aldous," he said. "He's met with Ruth Daly." She went still. "She's going to testify," Caleb said. The color that came into Alara's face was not dramatic. It was the quiet kind, the kind that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with something actual shifting inside a person. "She's going to testify," she repeated. "Aldous says she has specific recollections of 2 incidents, dates, details, consistent with the journal." He climbed the porch steps. "He says it changes the hearing substantially." Alara looked out at the yard, at the barn, the fence line, the road that ran down to town. She looked at all of it with the expression of someone who was allowing themselves to believe something they'd been afraid to believe. Clara made a sound against her chest. Alara looked down at her. "You hear that?" she said to her daughter quietly, in the voice she used when she talked to Clara and didn't know she was doing it. "Someone told the truth." Clara looked up at her with enormous, uncomplicated attention. And Caleb stood on his porch in the cold December air and watched a woman who had walked out of a frozen barn 2 months ago allow herself, carefully and without rushing it, to begin to believe that what she'd walked toward might actually hold. Ruth Daly arrived in Garrison on a Tuesday, 3 days before the hearing date Aldous had secured from the territorial court. She came on the stage, alone, with a single bag and the expression of a woman who had made a decision she wasn't entirely at peace with and had made it anyway. Caleb had never met her, but Aldous had described her. Mid-40s, brown hair, a scar along her left jaw from a childhood accident. And he spotted her getting off the stage from across the street and understood immediately that she was frightened. Not visibly, not in a way that most people would catch. But he'd spent enough time around Alara to recognize the specific way a person carried fear when they'd learned to carry it quietly. He introduced himself. She shook his hand with the grip of someone who needed to appear more certain than they felt. "Mrs. Daly," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Aldous said it mattered," she said. "I'm hoping he's right." He brought her out to the property that afternoon. Alara was on the porch when the wagon came up. And when she saw Ruth, she came down the steps, and the 2 women stood in the yard and looked at each other for a moment in the way of people who share a knowledge they never wanted to have. Then Alara said, "Ruth," and Ruth said, "I should have said something sooner." And Alara shook her head. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." They went inside. Caleb made coffee and found reasons to be in the barn. He didn't know what they said to each other that afternoon, and he didn't ask. He knew that some conversations needed privacy, not because they were secret, but because they were the kind that couldn't be witnessed without changing what they were. An hour passed, maybe more. When he came back in, Alara's eyes were red at the edges in a way that told him she'd been crying, which she almost never did in front of anyone. And Ruth was sitting with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, with the look of someone who had set something down that they'd been carrying for a long time. Clara was in Ruth's lap. Ruth was looking at her the way people looked at babies when they needed to look at something uncomplicated for a moment. "She's got your stubbornness," Ruth said to Alara. "She's 4 months old." "Already," Ruth said. "I can tell." The hearing was held in Cheyenne, not Garrison, which meant 2 days of travel each way and a night in a boarding house before they stood in front of a territorial judge named Clarence Whitfield, who had the reputation Aldous had described. Fair, unsentimental, not Marcus Vale's man, and not anyone's man in particular, which was as much as you could ask. The night before the hearing, Aldous went over it with Alara at the boarding house table, the same way he'd gone over everything, directly, without softening the edges. Whitfield will let Vale's lawyer speak first, he said. They'll present the writ petition, the argument about maternal instability, the narrative of a husband trying to recover his family. It'll be competent. Don't react to it, whatever they say. I know, Alara said. When it's your turn, you answer what I ask and nothing else. Don't offer extra. Don't explain yourself beyond what the question requires. Vale's lawyer will try to get you to elaborate, to clarify, to walk something back. Those are traps. Answer the question. Stop. Wait for the next one. I understand. Aldous looked at her. Are you all right? She thought about it honestly, the way she did most things. No, she said. But I'll be all right tomorrow. That's enough. He nodded. He looked at Caleb. You'll testify to finding her, the condition she was in, the injuries. Keep it factual. Dates, specifics. Don't characterize Vale, the journal, and Ruth do that. You just tell what you saw. All right, Caleb said. Get some sleep, Aldous said, and left them. They sat in the small room for a while after he'd gone, the boarding house quiet around them, Clara asleep in the travel crate Caleb had built, smaller than the one at home, designed to take apart and reassemble. Alara was looking at it. You built her 2 of those, she said. The first one was too big to travel with. You just built another one. Wasn't complicated, he said. She looked at him. There was something in her face that had been building for a long time, and he could see it, and he thought she was going to say something significant, and she said, You're a strange man, Caleb Whitmore. He considered this. Probably, he said. I mean it kindly. I know you do. She looked back at Clara. I keep trying to figure out what I would have done if the barn had been on someone else's property. Someone who didn't open the door. Don't think about that. I try not to. She was quiet. But it's there. The version of this where I knocked on a different door, or no door at all. She paused. I don't know what that version looks like. I don't want to. Then don't look at it, Caleb said. Look at this one. She did. She looked at the room, at Clara, at him, and then she said something she'd apparently decided she was going to say regardless of how it landed. Whatever happens tomorrow. And I think it's going to be all right. I think Aldous is right. I want you to know that you gave me back something I didn't think I was going to get back. She paused. I used to know who I was, before Marcus. I had a sense of myself that was mine, just mine. He spent 2 years working on that until I could barely find it. Another pause, and she said it simply. I found it again in your house. The boarding house was very quiet. Down the hall, someone was moving, and outside the street had the muffled sound of a winter city going about its evening. You found it yourself, Caleb said. I just didn't take up the space where it needed to be. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and picked up her coffee, and they sat together in the quiet and let that be enough for the night. The hearing room was smaller than Caleb had expected. Wood-paneled, practical, smelling of paper and cold, and the particular institutional composure of a place where difficult things were decided on a regular basis. Judge Whitfield was a tall man with a gray beard and reading glasses. He wore push down his nose, and he conducted the room with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to demonstrate his authority because there was no question of it. Marcus was there with 2 lawyers and Crane and the 2 writers waiting outside. He was in his best coat, and his face was the composed, sorrowful face of a concerned husband, and he looked at Alara when she came in with an expression of such practiced longing that Caleb had to look away from it to keep his own face under control. Aldous had been right about the order. Vale's lawyers spoke first, and they were good. Caleb gave them that. They presented the petition as a matter of a father's reasonable concern, of a child removed from a stable home by a mother in psychological distress, of a husband who had done nothing but try to find his family and bring them safely back. They cited the territorial statutes on marital custody with the ease of people who knew them well. They were careful never to say anything that was technically a lie. Whitfield listened with his glasses pushed down and his hands flat on the table in front of him. Then Aldous stood up, and he presented the counter-petition, and he put the journal on the table, the brown cloth-bound journal from the chimney breast in Laramie. And he put Alara's 11 pages of reconstructed testimony beside it, and he read the dates aloud, not all of them, just enough. Just the specific enough ones that the room understood exactly what they were listening to. He called Caleb first. Caleb told what he'd found in the barn, the morning of Thanksgiving, with the specific factual clarity Aldous had asked for. The temperature, the condition of Alara's boots, the way Clara had been bundled, the ribs. He described the injuries in the concrete language of a man who had dealt with physical damage his whole working life, not dramatizing, not characterizing, just the broken things and how they'd broken. Vale's lawyer cross-examined him with the tactic Aldous had predicted, the implication of improper motives, the suggestion that Caleb's judgment was compromised by personal attachment. Caleb answered each question with the same flat precision he'd answered Aldous's questions with. He didn't elaborate. He didn't defend himself. He just kept returning to the specific, verifiable facts of what he'd found on a Thanksgiving morning in a frozen barn, and the specific, verifiable facts didn't need defending. Then Ruth Daly testified. She testified for 40 minutes. She described 2 specific incidents she had witnessed in the Vale household, not secondhand, not inferred, but seen with her own eyes, from positions in the house that she described in detail, with the dates she remembered and the reasons she remembered those particular dates. She described leaving her position and why. She described being afraid to say anything at the time and why. She said this last part looking at Alara, not at the judge, and then she turned back to the judge and said it again for the record. When Vale's lawyer cross-examined her, she was steady in the way of a woman who had already been through the worst of what being in this room could do to her. The getting here, the deciding to speak, and what followed was just the necessary discomfort of having spoken. Alara testified last. She sat in the chair across from Judge Whitfield, and she answered Aldous's questions the way he'd told her to, directly, specifically, stopping when the answer was complete. She did not cry. She did not perform. She described her marriage and what had happened in it with the same clarity she'd brought to the Grange Hall 2 weeks ago, but more detailed now, more specific, the journal entries given voice in her own words with the dates attached. When Vale's lawyer cross-examined her and suggested that her account was the product of a destabilized mental state following childbirth, she looked at him with an expression so calm and direct that he shifted slightly in his chair. "I kept a journal for 14 months, she said, with dates, because I knew this is exactly what would be said, and I wanted there to be a record that didn't depend on the state of my mental health in any given moment. The record exists. The dates exist. What Mr. Vale's counsel is suggesting is that I fabricated 14 months of detailed, dated entries in some kind of continuous episode of instability." She paused. "I'd ask him which one he actually believes." Vale's lawyer said nothing. Whitfield's mouth moved briefly in something that was not quite an expression. Marcus testified on his own behalf, and he was, as Alara had always said he was, very good. I was composed and sorrowful and specific in the way of a man who had prepared carefully, and if Caleb hadn't spent 2 months learning to read the tells underneath the performance, he might have found it convincing. The slight over-tightness of the jaw, the care with which Marcus's eyes moved around the room, calculated even when they seemed spontaneous, the precise amount of emotion in his voice, enough to seem genuine, not enough to seem uncontrolled. Whitfield asked Marcus one question after the testimony was done. "Mr. Vale," he said, peering over his reading glasses, "your wife left your home on foot in November in Wyoming with a newborn infant, walked for multiple days in deteriorating weather. Does that account of events correspond with your understanding of what occurred?" Marcus said that it did, that Alara had left in a state of confusion and distress, that he'd been desperately worried. "And in your assessment," Whitfield said, "what would cause a woman to do that?" Marcus began to answer. Whitfield held up one hand. "Not what you believe she believed was happening," Whitfield said. "What would cause a woman, any woman, to leave on foot in November in Wyoming with a newborn infant? What set of circumstances produces that outcome?" Marcus was quiet for 3 full seconds, which in a courtroom was a very long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "No," Whitfield said. "I don't suppose you do." "What's—" The ruling came the following morning. Whitfield denied Vale's petition for the writ of return. He granted Alara full legal custody of Clara Voss. He used Voss, not Vale, which Aldous said was deliberate, pending a formal dissolution proceeding in which the question of Marcus's visitation rights would be separately addressed. a proceeding he strongly recommended Marcus consider carefully before initiating, given the evidentiary record now before the court. He referred the journal and Ruth Daly's testimony to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for review of potential criminal charges, which Aldis had not asked for and Whitfield had ordered on his own motion. He said before he dismissed the room, "A child's welfare is not a bargaining position. It is not leverage. Any future action in this court that treats it as such will be viewed accordingly." He left the bench. Vale's lawyers began gathering their papers with the contained efficiency of people managing a loss they'd been paid not to show. Marcus stood at the table for a moment, just a moment, and Caleb, watching him from across the room, saw the composed surface hold, and then, for just that moment, show something underneath. Not grief, not remorse. The specific cold fury of a man who had expected to win because he always had, encountering for perhaps the first time a situation in which that expectation had been simply incorrect. Then Marcus straightened his coat, and the surface closed over again, and he walked out of the room without looking at Alara. She was standing with Aldis, Clara against her chest, the ruling in her hand. She read it twice. Caleb stood beside her and waited. "It's done," Aldis said. He could appeal, but given what Whitfield's referred to the prosecutor's office, an appeal draws more attention to him, not less. "I don't think he'll appeal." Alara looked at the document. "Clara Voss," she said softly. "The name on the custody order." "It's her name if you want it to be," Aldis said. "The dissolution proceeding will formalize it." She nodded. She was very still. The way she went still when something was too large to process quickly. Clara was awake against her chest, looking around the room with the alert, indiscriminate curiosity she'd developed in the past few weeks. Everything equally interesting, everything worth examining. "Thank you," Alara said to Aldis. I can't adequately." "Thank me when the prosecutor's office acts on the referral," Aldis said. He was not cold about it, just practical. This was round one. He's lost the child. He still has his resources and his standing and his ability to make your life difficult in smaller ways. He paused. But the record is established now, publicly, legally, on paper. That matters for everything that comes after. He shook Caleb's hand, gathered his case, and left them standing in the emptying hearing room. Caleb looked at Alara. She looked back at him, and Clara looked at him over her mother's shoulder with those dark, uncomplicated eyes. And Caleb thought about a barn door frozen shut and the sound he'd almost dismissed as an animal, and how the distance between the person who'd almost walked back to the house and the person who'd pulled that door open was nothing more than a single moment of deciding to look. "Let's go home," he said. They drove back to Garrison over 2 days, the same way they'd come, and the difference in the quality of the silence on the return trip was something Caleb noticed but didn't try to name. Alara rode beside him on the wagon bench with Clara bundled between them when the cold got serious, and they talked more easily than they had on the way down, the specific ease of people who have been through something together and found out they were both still standing. She told him about her father again, more this time, the fuller version. He'd been a man who read too many books and understood practical life too little, who had loved her with the somewhat disorganized love of someone for whom love came more naturally than planning. He'd wanted good things for her and had not always known how to arrange for them, and she'd forgiven him for that a long time ago. "He would have liked you," she said. "How so?" "You don't talk very much," she said. He found that restful. He did enough talking for everyone he met. Caleb thought about this. "I'll take that." She smiled. Not the almost smile, not the working toward it. An actual smile, easy and unguarded in the pale winter light, and it changed her face in a way that he thought she probably didn't know it did. He looked back at the road. Bulk. Garrison received the news in the way small communities received all their significant news, faster than seemed possible, and with more detail than anyone could explain. By the time the wagon came up the main street, Hester Grange was on the sidewalk outside the dry goods with an expression that said she already knew, and she gave Caleb a single nod as they passed that communicated everything she intended it to communicate. Vera Marsh, the schoolteacher, stopped them at the edge of town. She came out to the road and stood by the wagon and said, to Alara, "I'm glad." Just that. Then she went back to wherever she'd been going. Coulter was not on the street. Caleb noted his absence without much feeling about it. People like Coulter didn't recant. They simply became quiet on a subject when the subject had been settled against them, and quietness was enough. The property looked the same as it always did. The barn, the yard, the house with the lamp. He'd left it burning when they left for Cheyenne, an old habit renewed. He pulled the wagon up and they got down, and Alara carried Clara inside and Caleb put the horses up. And when he came into the kitchen, she'd already started the stove and was standing at the counter doing nothing in particular, just standing in her kitchen. He'd started thinking of it as her kitchen without noticing when that had started, looking at the walls and the table and the lamp burning on the counter with the expression of someone returning to a place they hadn't been certain they'd return to. He hung up his coat. "I should probably," she started and stopped. "What?" She turned. She looked at him with the direct reading look she'd had since the barn, since before she'd known if he was safe, and what was in it now was different from what had been in it then. Not wariness, but something more complicated, something that held the entire shape of the past 3 months in it and was deciding what to do with that shape going forward. "I should probably," she said again, "figure out what comes next, practically. Where Clara and I go from here, what I do. I've been living in your house for 3 months, and I haven't figured that out because there were more urgent things to figure out. But now," she paused, "now there isn't anything more urgent." Caleb looked at her. He thought about what he wanted to say. He was not a man who found these particular things easy to say, not because he was afraid of them, but because he had always distrusted the kind of language that made them sound simpler than they were. He'd told Margaret he loved her approximately 300 times over the course of their marriage, and he'd meant it every time, and he'd also never found it adequate to what he actually felt, which was something more specific and less romantic and considerably more durable than the word suggested. "You could stay," he said. Alara looked at him. "Permanently," he said. "Both of you." He held her gaze. "I'm not saying it because you've got nowhere else. I'm saying it because this is where I want you to be, where I want you both to be." He paused. "That's a separate thing." She was very still. "I know what I am," he said. "I'm not an easy man to live with. I'm solitary and set in my habits, and I've been alone long enough that some of those habits are probably not going to change very much." He paused again, because he wanted to get this right, wanted it to be accurate rather than persuasive. "But I'd rather be those things with you here than whatever I was before you ended up in my barn." The fire worked in the stove. Clara made a small sound, exploring the sounds she could make with her own voice, the daily expanding inventory of them. "Caleb," Alara said, "you don't have to decide tonight." "I've decided," she said. He looked at her. 3 months ago I made the only decision I could make," she said. "I walked out a door with nothing, and I kept walking until I ran out of road. And the end of that road turned out to be a frozen barn on a Wyoming ranch, owned by a man who pulled the door open instead of ignoring what he heard." She looked at Clara, then back at him. "I've been thinking about what kind of person pulls that door open. It's not a complicated kind. It's just a person who decides the right thing is the right thing and does it without making a production of it." She paused. "I'd like to stay near that kind of person for a long time." He stood in the kitchen that had been his for 15 years, that had been empty of everything but function for 6 of them, and felt the specific fullness of a space that had been added to in a way that changed its fundamental character. "All right," he said, because it was. They were married in March on a Thursday, in the land office of all places, because it was warm and the justice of the peace worked next door, and Caleb had no patience for ceremony, and Alara had had enough of ceremony to last several lifetimes. Hester Grange was the witness, along with Burl, who shook Caleb's hand with both of his and said nothing because he didn't need to. Ruth Daly had gone back to Casper but sent a letter that arrived the week before, which Alara read twice and folded carefully and put in the same drawer where she kept the custody order with Clara's name on it. Aldous had been right about the appeal. Marcus Vale did not file one. The Territorial Prosecutor's Office opened a formal inquiry based on Whitfield's referral, and this inquiry, along with the existence of a documented evidentiary record that was now part of the Territorial Court's public files, produced an effect that legal proceedings sometimes produced, and that all the Grange Hall meetings in the world could not. It made Marcus Vale's position in Laramie untenable. Not overnight, not dramatically. But the people who'd thought highly of him because they only saw what he wanted them to see were now seeing something else. and the distance between a man's public reputation and his private record had a way of collapsing when it became impossible to maintain. He sold the Laramie property by summer. Caleb heard about it from Aldous in a letter, brief and factual, the way Aldous communicated. He showed it to Alara, who read it and set it on the table and went back to what she'd been doing, which was repairing a fence post on the east side of the property with a methodology that Caleb had not taught her, and that was, he had to admit, more efficient than his own. "You're not going to say anything?" he asked. "About Marcus selling his house?" "Yes." She drove another nail. "I'm not going to spend a minute of this life thinking about Marcus Vale that I don't absolutely have to." He considered this. "Fair," he said. She drove the nail flush, stood, tested the post. It held. "This one's better than the last 3 you did," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "You're better at this than me." "I'm better at several things," she said. Not boasting, just accurate. He did not disagree. Clara turned 1-year-old in November, 3 days before Thanksgiving. Alara made a cake that was lopsided in a way that annoyed her and delighted Clara, who was walking now, had been walking for 6 weeks, with the lurching, committed momentum of someone who had decided that mobility was non-negotiable and was going to insist on it regardless of the physics involved. She had fallen down more times than either of them had counted, and had treated each fall with the brief outrage of someone who found gravity personally offensive and then gotten up. On the morning of her birthday, she walked across the kitchen, which she had done 100 times, and then she walked to Caleb, who was sitting at the table with his coffee, and grabbed his pant leg and looked up at him with Margaret's quilt pattern eyes. She had her mother's eyes exactly, dark and direct, and said something that was almost certainly not a word yet, but was working in the direction of words with the same determined momentum she applied to everything. He picked her up. She grabbed his ear with the precise grip that still surprised him every time, as if she was recalibrating the amount of force required, and he made the face, the involuntary one, the one that had almost produced her first smile 8 months ago. And she laughed. The full laugh, the one she'd developed in the past month, which was a ridiculous sound, too big for her, borrowed from some future version of herself. Alara was at the counter, not watching, but she was smiling at the counter in the way of a person pretending not to listen to something. He thought about Thomas. He thought about him directly, which he could do now without the particular tearing quality the thought used to have. He could think about Thomas as Thomas, a specific boy with specific habits and a specific laugh, rather than as the shape of everything that had been taken. They were not the same. Clara was not Thomas, and he was not trying to make her be. But the fact that there was room in him to hold both, the grief and this, the loss and this ordinary Thursday morning with a 1-year-old pulling his ear, was something he hadn't known about himself until he was inside it. Some things you only found out by being forced to look. There were still hard days, days when the weight of what Alara had survived surfaced in her in ways that didn't resolve easily, when she startled at sounds in the night, when someone in town said something with an edge to it that most people wouldn't have noticed, but that she heard with the finely tuned attention of a woman who had spent 2 years monitoring tone for threat. Days when she was short with him for no reason she could name, and they were both terse and awkward until one of them said something honest, and they came back to level ground. He was not always patient. She was not always easy. They were two people with significant damage between them trying to build something that worked, which was the exact condition of most worthwhile things. But the house was warm. That was the simplest way to say it. Not in the way of a pleasant metaphor, literally warm, because Alara had opinions about the stove and how much wood to put in and when, opinions she held with a conviction that had turned into a minor ongoing negotiation, and the result was that the house was warmer than it had been in years, which Clara appreciated and Caleb had quietly come to appreciate as well, though he would never say so in a way that conceded the argument. The ranch was working better than it had in years. Alara had taken to the practical work of it with the same methodical approach she brought to everything. She learned what she didn't know and asked questions without embarrassment, and within a season had opinions about the cattle operation that were, with some frequency, correct. She'd negotiated a grazing agreement with the property to the east that Caleb had been trying to arrange for 3 years, by the simple expedient of going to speak to the owner directly and being straightforward about what they needed and what they could offer, which had worked immediately. "How did you do that in one conversation?" he asked, when she came back with the signed agreement. "I told him the truth," she said. People generally respond to that. I told him the truth, Caleb said. 3 times. You told him a practical truth, she said. I told him a human one. I told him we were trying to build something here and that the east grazing would make a significant difference, and that I hoped he was the kind of neighbor who understood what that meant. Caleb looked at the agreement. He has a daughter, Alara said, in Denver. He misses her. I listened to him talk about her for 20 minutes before we got to the grazing, and at the end he signed. She folded her hands on the table. People mostly want to be heard. That's all. You give them that, and the rest follows. He stood there a moment, holding the agreement that represented 3 years of his failed negotiation. You're going to be insufferable about this, he said. I'm going to be accurate about this, she said, which will seem like the same thing to you. He put the agreement in the drawer with the other papers, and when he turned around, she was already doing something else, already on to the next thing, the way she moved through the world, forward, purposeful, without much time spent looking back. He had married a woman with more force in her than she'd been allowed to use for 2 years, and now that she was using it, he understood both why someone like Marcus had needed to suppress it and how fundamentally that suppression had always been doomed to fail. You could not take something like that out of a person permanently. You could only drive it underground where it waited. On Thanksgiving morning, 1 year after Caleb had heard a sound in a frozen barn and followed it, Alara stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at the yard. The barn, the fence, the road, the pale early light coming across the land that was flat and clear and cold and entirely itself. Clara was asleep. Thursday, the Grange's horse, was in the pasture. They'd named the horse Thursday in a moment of sentiment that neither of them had expected of themselves. The house was quiet in the way it was quiet now, which was different from the way it had been quiet before. The way a room was different when it was empty because everyone was sleeping rather than because there was no one to sleep in it. Caleb came in from checking the livestock. He brought Cold in with him the way he always did, and she handed him his coffee without turning around because she'd heard his boots on the porch and poured it before he came through the door. He stood beside her at the window. 1 year, she said. 1 year, he agreed. They looked out at the yard together, the place where she'd walked from the barn to the house that first morning, moving carefully through the snow with broken ribs and a newborn, following a man she hadn't known whether to trust. The porch where he'd stood and watched Marcus Vale's coach come up the road. The gate where he'd told an investigator and then a marshal that they were on the wrong side of his fence. I've been thinking, she said, about what it means. The thing that changed everything. What thing? The barn door, she said. You could have not opened it. You heard something and you could have decided it was an animal and gone back to your coffee, and that would have been reasonable. It would have been the sensible thing. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? He thought about it. He'd thought about it before in the way you thought about the things that turned out to be significant, trying to find the logic in them, the principle, the moment of choice you could point to and say, there, that was the one that mattered. I don't know, he said. I heard something and I went to look. That's all it was. That's all it was, she said. Most things are, he said. You hear something and you decide whether to go look. She was quiet for a moment, turning the coffee cup in her hands. The people who never open the door, she said. I don't think they're bad people, mostly. I think they just convinced themselves they didn't really hear anything, that it was probably an animal, that someone else will handle it. Probably, he said. And the people who open it, they just don't give themselves that option. They don't let themselves look away. He thought about the barn door, the frozen hinges, the ice along the frame, the moment when he'd put his weight against it and it had cracked open, how he'd nearly lost his footing. It's not virtue, he said. I don't think it's virtue. I think it's just deciding that you're the one who's going to look and then looking. She considered this. My father would have opened the door, she said after a while. He sounds like a man who would have. He was impractical and disorganized, and he didn't know how to protect me from Marcus. She paused. But he would have opened the door. He always did. Every time there was something that needed looking at. She said it the way she talked about him, with the specific love you had for people who were gone and imperfect and fully known. I think that's what I got from him. The only useful thing, maybe. The not looking away. It's enough, Caleb said. That's more than enough to get from someone. The morning light was strengthening across the yard, doing what morning light did in November in Wyoming. Not warm, not generous, but honest. Clear and cold and truthful about what things were. Inside, from the back room, came the first sound of Clara waking. The small exploring sounds of a child calibrating the morning, deciding whether it was worth the effort of full consciousness. Then the sounds that meant she'd decided, yes, she was awake, and the world should know it. Alara set down her coffee. She went to get her daughter. Caleb heard her voice in the back room, low and specific. The voice she used with Clara that was different from every other register she had. And Clara's sounds escalating into the full morning declaration of someone who was hungry and awake and pleased about the world in equal measure. He stood at the window a moment longer. He thought about what Alara had said, about the door, about deciding to look. He thought about 6 years of maintaining a property alone and calling it survival, which it had been, and what it turned out survival had been waiting for, which was a reason to do more than survive. He thought about Thomas, clearly and without the tearing quality, just the simple truth of a boy who had been and was gone and was loved still. He thought about Margaret and her quilts and her opinions about the stove and how she would have liked Alara enormously and told him so with considerable directness. You carried the people you lost. That was just true. You carried them, and they became part of the structure of who you were, the foundation under everything you built afterward. The building wasn't a betrayal of them. The building was what the foundation was for. He picked up his coffee. Alara came back into the kitchen with Clara on her hip, and Clara saw him and made the sound she made when she saw him, which was not a word yet but was becoming one, working its way toward the specific syllable she was trying to produce. She reached for him. He took her, and she grabbed his ear, and Alara leaned against the counter and watched them with the expression she had in these moments. Not sentimental, not soft, just clear and certain, the look of a woman who knew exactly where she was and had decided it was where she wanted to be. Outside, the light came on across the land. The same land it had always been, flat and cold and indifferent and enormous. The land that didn't care what happened on it, that would be there long after all of them were gone. But inside there was breakfast to make, and a 1-year-old making increasingly insistent claims on the morning, and the stove to feed, and a fence on the south side that needed attention before the next hard freeze, and 2 people who had come to this life from the wreckage of other lives and found in it not a compensation, not a replacement, but something actual, something built from what they were rather than what they'd imagined they should be. Caleb set Clara on the counter where she could watch, because she insisted on watching everything now, and he started breakfast, and Alara started the stove, and the sounds of a Thursday morning in November filled a house that had been quiet for too long and was quiet no longer. And that was, in the end, the whole of the story. A frozen door opened, a sound followed, a stranger given a warm kitchen and a cup of coffee, and the simple, sufficient words that turned out to be true. You're safe